I'll never forget the time my sister Megan and I were left home alone on a quiet Friday night. Our parents had gone out for a well-deserved date night, leaving us to our own devices. I was 12 at the time, and Megan was 13. We lived in a modest two-story house in a suburban neighborhood, the kind of place where you could hear everything going on, even from one floor to another. The creaks and groans of the old house were something we had grown used to, but that night, things felt different. We were both doing our own thing in our respective rooms upstairs. Megan was likely lost in one of her books, while I was probably immersed in some video game, the soft glow of the screen lighting up my room. The evening was quiet, almost eerily so, until I heard it, a faint, rhythmic tapping sound coming from downstairs in the den. It was subtle at first, barely audible over the hum of the video game, but as it persisted, it became impossible to ignore. Curiosity got the better of me, and I paused my game, straining to listen. The tapping continued, steady and deliberate, like someone was knocking on the back door. I immediately thought it was Megan trying to mess with me, so I decided to go down and catch her in the act. As I descended the stairs, the tapping grew louder, but there was something unsettling about it, something that didn't sit right. When I reached the den, the room was dimly lit by the streetlights filtering through the windows. The shadows cast by the furniture seemed to stretch and twist in the low light, giving the room an ominous feel. I hesitated before flipping on the porch light, and when I did, my heart skipped a beat. There, standing on the other side of the glass, was a man I had never seen before. He looked to be in his mid-40s, with long black hair that was starting to gray. His face was flushed, his cheeks red as if he had been out in the cold for too long. He was tall, probably around 6', and his eyes, though seemingly non-threatening, held an intensity that made me uneasy. He didn't belong here, especially not in our backyard, and every instinct in me screamed to run away. But something about the way he was looking at me made me hesitate. He didn't seem aggressive, more like he was desperate, as if he needed help. Against my better judgment, I cracked open the small window in the door to hear what he had to say. His voice was shaky as he asked if he could use our phone. I immediately questioned him. Why was he in our backyard, and why didn't he go to a neighbor's house? Instead of answering, he just pleaded with me, his voice growing more urgent. He begged me to let him in, saying it was an emergency. My mind was racing, torn between fear and the desire to help someone in need. But the fear won out. I told him I was sorry, but I couldn't let him in and that he needed to leave. When he didn't move, I added that I would call the police if he didn't go away. As I tried to slide the window shut, his hand darted out, blocking it. He started reaching inside, trying to unlock the door from the inside. Panic surged through me, and I yelled for Megan. The sound of my voice must have startled him because he quickly pulled his arm back and took a step away from the door. Megan came running down the stairs, her face pale with worry. She peeked around the corner, her eyes widening when she saw the man still standing there. Without hesitation, she grabbed the phone and called our parents. They told her to hang up and call the police immediately and to stay upstairs until they arrived. We retreated to our rooms, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. Every creak and groan of the house seemed amplified in the silence that followed, each one sending a fresh wave of fear through me. But there were no more taps, no more sounds from downstairs, just an eerie, oppressive silence. After what felt like an eternity, my fear gave way to a reckless sense of bravery. I needed to know if the man was still there. I crept back downstairs, my footsteps barely making a sound on the old wooden floorboards. The den was still and quiet, the only light coming from the faint glow of the porch light outside. The man was no longer at the door, but something caught my eye. The window was lower than I had left it. A cold dread washed over me as I realized I hadn't closed it properly. My eyes scanned the room, and that's when I noticed the office door was ajar. I could have sworn it had been shut earlier, but now it was open, the darkness inside impenetrable. Fear rooted me to the spot, but I knew I had to check. I slowly moved towards the door, every instinct telling me to turn back, but I couldn't. I pulled out my phone, switched on the camera, and turned on the flash. My hands trembled as I pressed the shutter button. The flash illuminated the room for a split second, but it was enough. There, hunched over my dad's desk, was the man. His head was turned towards me, his eyes wide and wild, as if caught in the act. He looked like he was about to lunge at me, his body tense, ready to spring. I didn't wait to find out. I bolted upstairs, my feet barely touching the ground as I ran. I slammed the den door shut and locked it, my breaths coming in ragged gasps. The familiar light tapping began again, but this time it was on the den door, and I could hear him whispering, pleading with me to let him in. I cried out for Megan, my voice cracking with fear. In a desperate move, I yelled through the door that the police had arrived, hoping it would scare him off. The tapping stopped abruptly, and I heard the back door creak open and then slam shut. The police arrived a few minutes later, but by then, the man was long gone. They searched the house and the surrounding area, but there was no sign of him. The officers told us we had done the right thing by not letting him in, but their reassurances did little to calm the fear that had taken root in my chest. For weeks after, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every creak, every rustle in the night made my heart race. I often found myself waking up in a cold sweat, my mind replaying the image of the man's face, the way his eyes had locked onto mine as if he could see right into my soul. Even now, years later, the memory of that night lingers in the back of my mind. The sense of violation of having someone so close, yet so dangerous, in our home is something I'll never forget. It's a reminder of how fragile our sense of safety can be and how quickly it can be shattered. It was a crisp autumn weekend when my father, Cliff, decided to take his girlfriend's younger brother, Adam, on his first hunting trip. Adam had always been eager to experience the thrill of the hunt, and my dad was more than happy to introduce him to the sport. They planned to spend the weekend at a secluded hunting cabin deep in the woods of Braxton County, West Virginia, a place my dad had visited many times before. My father had called ahead to his uncle, who owned a large piece of land out in the middle of nowhere. The land was vast, covered in dense forests and rolling hills, a perfect spot for hunting. His uncle had agreed to let them use his cabin, assuring my dad that they would have plenty of deer to hunt. As they drove deeper into the wilderness, the roads became narrower and more treacherous. The dense forest on either side seemed to close in on them, the towering trees casting long, ominous shadows. By the time they reached the cabin, the sun had dipped below the horizon, and the sky was a deep shade of purple. The cabin was not what they had expected. It was small, much smaller than my dad remembered, with only 2 rooms and a rickety porch that creaked with every step. The wooden exterior was weathered and worn, and the windows were bare, with no curtains to block out the night. Inside, the cabin was dimly lit by a few old lanterns, the flickering light casting eerie shadows on the walls. My dad and Adam unloaded their gear, setting up their sleeping bags on the narrow cots that lined the walls. The cabin felt cold and unwelcoming, a stark contrast to the warmth and comfort of home. But they were determined to make the best of it, eager for the hunt that awaited them in the morning. As they settled in for the night, the stillness of the forest outside seemed to seep into the cabin. The only sounds were the distant hoots of owls and the occasional rustle of leaves as the wind blew through the trees. Adam, who had been excited just hours before, now seemed uneasy, his eyes darting towards the dark windows. "Are you sure it's safe out here?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Of course," my dad replied, trying to sound reassuring. "We're miles away from anyone. It's just us and the deer." But Adam couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't alone. He kept glancing towards the windows, his imagination conjuring up images of wild animals or worse, something more sinister lurking just out of sight. The unease only grew as the night wore on. Around midnight, they heard a loud clanging sound outside, like metal trash cans being banged together. Adam sat up, his heart pounding in his chest. "Did you hear that?" he asked, his voice trembling. "It's probably just a bear or something," my dad said, trying to sound casual, but even he couldn't hide the unease in his voice. "Go back to sleep. We got a long day tomorrow." But sleep was impossible. The sounds outside continued, growing louder and more persistent. It wasn't just a bear. They could hear what sounded like footsteps crunching on the gravel outside, moving closer to the cabin. My dad lay still, his eyes fixed on the ceiling, listening to the sounds outside. Then, without warning, there was a loud scraping noise, like nails or claws being dragged down the side of the cabin. The sound sent a shiver down his spine. "Cliff, there's something out there," Adam whispered, his voice filled with fear. "Stay quiet," my dad replied, his own voice barely above a whisper. He reached for his rifle, the cold metal reassuring in his hands. He motioned for Adam to do the same, and together they lay in the darkness, listening to the sounds outside. The scraping noise moved along the side of the cabin, stopping just beneath the window next to Adam's bed. They could hear something or someone outside, moving around, almost as if it were searching for a way in. And then it started, the tapping. It was soft at first, barely audible, but it grew louder with each passing second. It was coming from the window, a steady, rhythmic tap, 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 as if someone was knocking on the glass. Neither of them dared to move. The tapping continued, relentless and unnerving. My dad's mind raced, trying to figure out what was outside. Was it an animal, drawn by the smell of their food? Or was it something more sinister, something with far more malicious intent? He glanced over at Adam, who was clutching his rifle with white-knuckled hands. The fear in his eyes was unmistakable. My dad knew they couldn't just sit there, waiting for whatever was outside to make its move. "Load your gun," he whispered, his voice tense. Adam nodded, fumbling with the bullets as he tried to load his weapon. The tapping continued, growing louder, more insistent. My dad took a deep breath, trying to steady his nerves. He couldn't see anything outside. The darkness beyond the windows was too thick, but he could feel it. The presence of something out there, something that didn't belong. The tapping stopped suddenly, and for a moment, there was nothing but silence. My dad's heart was pounding so hard he could barely hear anything else. And then, without warning, there was a loud bang on the wall, followed by the sound of footsteps running away from the cabin. Neither of them moved for what felt like an eternity. They just lay there, clutching their rifles, waiting for something else to happen. But the only sounds that followed were the distant calls of owls and the rustling of leaves in the wind. When dawn finally broke, they didn't waste any time. They packed up their gear and left the cabin as quickly as possible, not even bothering to cook breakfast. As they drove away, my dad couldn't shake the feeling that they had narrowly escaped something terrible. They returned to my dad's uncle's house, their nerves still on edge. When they told him what had happened, he just laughed it off, insisting that they were probably just imagining things. But my dad knew what he had heard, and so did Adam. Neither of them ever went back to that cabin again. The memory of that night, of the tapping on the window and the scraping along the walls, was enough to keep them away for good. Even now, years later, my dad refuses to talk about it. He says it was probably just an animal, maybe a raccoon or a bear. But there's a look in his eyes when he says it, a look that tells me he doesn't really believe that. Whatever was out there that night, it wasn't just an animal. It was something far more unsettling, something that still haunts him to this day. If you've made it this far, you're 100% a horror fanatic, and we approve. If you love our campfire-themed horror storytelling experience, hit that subscribe button so you don't miss out on our daily uploads. I was 19 years old when I landed a job at a rundown motel on the outskirts of town. It wasn't the most glamorous job, but it paid the bills, and I needed the money. The motel was the kind of place that had seen better days, faded paint, cracked signs, and a clientele that was more interested in keeping a low profile than enjoying a good night's sleep. I worked both as a desk clerk and a housekeeper, which meant I got to deal with the customers coming in at all hours of the night, and then clean up the messes they left behind in the morning. It wasn't uncommon for the cops to show up multiple times a week, responding to everything from noise complaints to drug busts. It was a sketchy place, to say the least. One afternoon, I was assigned to clean the rooms in the second building of the motel, the one furthest from the office. I hated working over there. It was always eerily quiet, with most of the rooms vacant and the atmosphere heavy with neglect. The rooms were old and worn down, the kind of place you wouldn't want to spend more than a few minutes in if you could help it. I was in one of the last rooms on my list, trying to finish up as quickly as possible. It was getting late, and the sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the parking lot. The room I was cleaning was vacant, so I was surprised when I suddenly felt like I wasn't alone. I was wiping down the mirror above the dresser when I noticed something in the reflection. A man standing in the doorway watching me. He was in his mid-50s, with dirty, greasy hair that hung limply around his face. His clothes were rumpled and stained, and he had a smell about him, like car oil mixed with alcohol. Startled, I spun around, nearly dropping the cleaning supplies in my hands. "Oh my God, you scared me," I blurted out, trying to keep my voice steady. The man just stood there, a crooked grin spreading across his face. He didn't say anything at first, just watched me with a look that made my skin crawl. There was no reason for him to be in that room. The room was supposed to be empty. I remembered the recent staff meeting where my boss had emphasized the importance of customer satisfaction, urging us to be polite and helpful to the guests. So, despite the alarm bells going off in my head, I forced a smile and asked, "Is there anything I can help you with, sir? Towels, maybe?" He just kept grinning, and then slowly, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a $100 bill, holding it out towards me. My heart skipped a beat. No one tips $100 for cleaning a $40 a night room. "My name's Terry," he finally said, his voice a low, gravelly drawl. "I'm staying in the room next door with my wife, Sherry." He chuckled, as if their rhyming names were some kind of joke. But there was something in his eyes, something dark and unsettling. I forced a laugh, trying to keep things light. "That's nice," I said, glancing at the door, hoping he would take the hint and leave. But he didn't move. "I was watching you," he continued, his grin widening. "Me and my wife, we were watching you. We thought maybe you'd like to come have some fun with us." My heart stopped. I felt like I was going to be sick. "No, I'm sorry, I can't do that," I stammered, taking a step back. I wanted to run, to scream, to do anything to get away from him, but he was blocking the door, my only exit. The man's grin faded, replaced by a look of cold determination. "Come on," he said, his voice softening, taking on a more menacing tone. "It'll be fun. Just come over and say hi. Sherry's real nice, you'll like her." I shook my head, backing away until I was pressed up against the dresser. "No, I really have to finish my work," I said, my voice trembling. "Please, just go back to your room." For a moment, he just stood there, staring at me, his eyes boring into mine. Then finally, he grunted and turned away, shuffling out of the room. I watched him go, my body frozen with fear. As soon as he was out of sight, I slammed the door shut and locked it. My mind was racing. There was no wife. This man was dangerous, and I had narrowly escaped something terrible. I needed to call for help, but when I picked up the phone, there was no dial tone. The line was dead. Panic set in. My cell phone was outside on the housekeeping cart, but getting to it meant opening the door, and I wasn't sure if Terry was still out there. I cracked the door open just enough to peek outside. The coast seemed clear, so I hurried out, frantically searching the cart for my phone. Just as I found it, I heard Terry's voice again, shouting to someone I couldn't see. "She's running. She's getting away." I didn't wait to see who he was talking to. I bolted, running as fast as I could towards the office. My heart was pounding in my ears, my breath coming in short, panic gasps. I could hear footsteps behind me, getting closer with each step. I rounded the corner and spotted the stockroom. Without thinking, I ducked inside and locked the door behind me. I could hear them outside, Terry and someone else, their voices low and urgent as they searched for me. I crouched down in the corner, my hands trembling as I dialed the number for the front desk. My boss answered, his voice calm and reassuring, but I was too scared to make sense of his words. All I could think about was Terry and the other man still out there, still looking for me. I stayed hidden in the stockroom for what felt like hours, waiting until I was sure they had given up. When I finally made it back to the front desk, I collapsed into my boss's arms, the adrenaline leaving me weak and shaky. The police arrived within minutes, but by then, Terry and his accomplice were long gone. They searched the motel, but there was no sign of them. It wasn't until later that I found out Terry was wanted for a string of violent crimes, including sexual assault and kidnapping. I had narrowly escaped becoming his next victim. A few weeks later, Terry was finally caught, but the experience left me traumatized. I quit my job at the motel soon after, unable to shake the feeling of being watched, of knowing that someone out there had wanted to hurt me. Even now, years later, the memory of that day haunts me. The fear, the helplessness, the knowledge that I was so close to something terrible. It's something I'll never forget. I've moved on with my life, but the scars from that experience will always be there. A reminder of just how fragile our sense of safety can be.